Good afternoon. The title of the presentation today is Innovating with Common Property, Resisting Neoliberalism. It is 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sleeping in this little hat, and I'm awaking in the corner of a plaza in a community called Kocha in the Peruvian Andes. I'm awaking because there is noise, camiones, the trucks are coming. And they are coming because today is a very important day. It's the Friday Fair Market. They are coming for that, and this is a social innovation. This community, Kocha, have suffered for many years environmental degradation, poverty, and lack of housing for many of the people, young people especially. So the community decided to do two very important things. One, start evaluating using traditional knowledge and knowledge from the university, evaluating the land and decide to rest. They cannot keep going more and more, putting more pressures in the land. And secondly, and this is very important because it's the point of this story, they decide as a community to rent little parcels, use their common plaza for a Friday market. They are 3,500 meters above sea level. And they all other communities around there, and they all go to the little town 3-4 hours away. Well, with the plaza, now everyone comes there. From Urubamba, from Lima, from all the places between, they come there. As you can see here, they sell all kinds of things. All products from the north, from the jungle, plastic, all kinds of things. So they don't have to go anymore to this big city. They create a plaza. And what is interesting with it is, and then you see coca leaves, you see all kinds of fruits, vegetables from all over the place. And what is interesting with this is that they use this enterprise as a collective. They use a common resource, the common plaza. This is produced, all the funding for renting these little spaces go to community services, go for education, for the school, for the pharmacy, for the clinic, and other needs that the community have. These days, we call this social enterprise. But social enterprise have existed for years. Perhaps it's the history of social or human civilization. Human beings have to innovate and have to survive. And communities like Kocha have been engaging in the whole process of social innovation for many years. Now, there are many definitions of social enterprises, and people, talk about different definitions, but for the purpose of these presentations, we are just going to use a very broad definition, exchange of goods and services in order to serve fundamentally social purpose. Now, social enterprise have become something of a hero since 1990s. Governments, universities acknowledge it, recognize it. They also create programs. There are all kinds of different programs in governments and universities. But not only that, we, over these years, faculty members, professors, we have celebrated what's good. It's good to recognize social value in the business context. But, and of course, for some of us, we finally have a label. We were creators walking in the halls of business school with people figuring out what we do. And now, finally, we had a label. But the concept and attention to its practice grew up along the rise and diffusion of neoliberalism. And so far, we have tended to look at it as apolitical, ahistorical, even though we recognize that because the shrinkage of the welfare state and social services, the increasing of the, give rise to a number of social enterprises now. Now, there have been growing concerns about neoliberalism. And with that brings with it concerns about social enterprises. Some of the concerns about neoliberalism have to do with privatization. Many of us have witnessed the protest, privatization of social services, privatization of water. Problems of privatization of water have not been only poor Bolivia, poor country like Bolivia. It's now here, in my own hometown, in Vancouver, in BC. We are dealing now with those issues, privatization of water. Of course, other concerns have been the impacts of neoliberalism, and especially, particularly, the adjustment programs. The ajustes, we say in Latin America, the ajuste of the 80s and the 90s implemented by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And perhaps the most concerning impact of neoliberalism have been with regard to inequality, economic and social inequality. And there has been important studies done that connect both of them, the inequality and the neoliberalism. Some of them by Piketty, and of course there have been a bestseller, huge database. Some of them for Wilkinson, for example, that show us that inequality is bad for everyone. It's bad for society, it's bad for communities, it's bad for our mental and physical health. And of course, Stiglitz have been one of the major players in pointing out the inequality in the United States, as well as the impacts of the World Bank. He has been a member of the World Bank, a vice president of the World Bank, the impact of these adjustment programs in poor countries and the kind of a structural inequality it causes. So scholars have been asking, social enterprise scholars have been asking questions about that too. A scholar like Simon Teasdale, Pascal Day, Ray Dart, Maria Humphreys, and others have been raising questions about what is the moral legitimacy of social enterprise. So we are at a stage to start asking questions about this discourse, about this market, the solutions for everything, which we have become to that point, and start questioning. Some of the questions really are about how to assess the relationship between these two developments, right? Should increased attention to social enterprise be regarded as apolitical, as an adaptive response to certain kinds of market failure? Should it be seen as instead of a rolling out neoliberalism into yet more sectors of society? Or perhaps we can see as a counter-movement to neoliberalism, contesting its assumptions and planting alternatives. Our thesis is that where there is a case to be made, and have been very well made by many of our colleagues around how social enterprises are serving the cause of neoliberalism, our thesis is that it is possible to see some social enterprises essentially for the neoliberal cause, but there is at least one important strand of social enterprise that should be seen as a fundamental resistant. Let's remind us what neoliberalism is about. Human well-being, neoliberalism, capitalism is based on the belief that human well-being individually and aggregate is best achieved by individual entrepreneurial skills, by unleashing the individual entrepreneurial skills and freedoms in an environment characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. In a sense, neoliberalism fundamentally is hyper-capitalism, where the assumption is that the primary human motivation is the pursuit of self-interest. So we are under neoliberalism, we are all homo economicus. We are all looking after ourselves, maximizing our possibilities. So, and free markets and individual incentives are the best way to maximize benefit of society. Of course, here is the picture of Margaret Thatcher, who didn't believe in community. So it's just individuals. The short story is, in answering this question, what is the relationship between neoliberalism and social enterprise? The short story is that social enterprise is no homogeneous group. Let me put here this picture of the galaxy that Fournier and Nissen gave us, that image to us. And as you can see, we have a center here, but we have different coordinates, different ways to go. And in a way, our proposal is that, well, we agree with all the criticism about that relationship. Social enterprises vary in the relationship to the neoliberalism, right? So at least some social enterprise, we believe, some advance the neoliberal cause, but there is diversity, as the galaxy have shown. There is a whole different coordinators, and there is a dynamic continuum, right? In some social enterprises are neoliberal creation, and they are pushing the neoliberal ideology and the marketization of the social enterprise and not-for-profits and so on. But there is lots of space here. And in another sense, there is the social enterprises that are counter their neoliberalism. They are resisting neoliberalism. And that's the point of our paper. Now, let's return to Kocha. Social enterprise is a social enterprise with a wrinkle. They are not only being a social entrepreneur as a community and having multiple goals, but they are also based on something that is different than what the prevalent view of development is about, right? They are doing based on common property, which goes against all these neoliberal views on how development should take place. We have been taught that the way that development takes place is individual. It's through individual and property rights. Well, this goes at odds with that, because it's collective, it's the community, and it's based, importantly, in the institution of common property. And there are other fascinating examples. Let's look at them.
Listen up, New York. We got a problem.
You could look around and you could see the changes.
My friends that lived across the street from me, they're gone. And the bodegas that I used to go to all the time, they're gone too.
The rent is going up, the maintenance fee is going up.
A lot of the folks in the neighborhood are regularly displaced.
I have been placed in the shelter system.
I think roughly there's 250,000 people homeless in New York City.
Where is the housing for us? Not shelter, housing, affordable housing, homes.
Real estate will let you think that we don't have enough supply for the demand, but we know there are enough vacant buildings that can be rehabilitated and turned into permanent, affordable, and I mean affordable for those of us who are low income, housing in the city of New York.
We're in a community that's gentrifying.
There is always developer just ready to get their hands on the building.
And in New York City, real estate has controlled the city since the beginning of its history.
Gentrification and real estate speculation in New York are really a struggle over land. Land in New York is treated like a commodity, which means that it's bought and sold by individuals, corporations, to the highest bidder. The people who live in neighborhoods don't have a say in how this happens. And we believe that there is another way. We know that there is. It's through holding land in common using something called community land trust.
A community land trust is a nonprofit organization that owns land.
It essentially separates ownership of the land from the buildings and other uses above it.
Be it a house, a business, maybe a garden.
The CLT holds the land permanently out of the market, and it is responsible for putting that land to use for the benefit of people who live in a particular geographic area.
So, community land trust. This problem is not only in New York. We have problems in Vancouver. We have problems, I'm sure, here. We have problems in London. We have problems in many cities that we see empty apartments, buildings, while people don't have homeless people is in the street. So the community land trust basically is ownership of land where it's separated from ownership of home. And the land is the most expensive part of the home. So the community body, collective, owns the land in common. The community land trust leases land to the homeowner. Right? Homeowner builds, buys, and owns his or her home. So there is a combination. Basically, it takes a land out of the speculation, takes the land out of the market in order to make it accessible to people like the people we see here in New York. And of course, there are other examples. Social co-ops in Italy, right? There are different kinds of social co-ops. They try to serve, and they are serving people just beyond just the traditional co-op membership. And what is important here is that it's based on pool of capital and assets that is held in common, that is indivisible, and that help people beyond the traditional co-op. CB, community-based enterprise in indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are based on ancestral lands, laws around the world. Right now, for example, I'm doing some research project with a community, sub-community, very close to in Vancouver Island, close to my home, where they, as a community, using the common land, the common property, are building solar panels and generating benefits for the whole community. Now, we call this CPSIS, Common Property Social Enterprises. And these are defined as forms of social enterprise. They employ common property as their principal format of capital foundation and accumulation, managed collectively by community for community benefit. Now, when we talk about property, we always tend to think that is individual property, private property. That's how we have been thinking about property. But this is a very narrow view of seeing property. Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize, have a study and let us know that there are different it's a variety, a rich variety of forms of property across different cultures. Now, for this presentation, we are just looking at 3. And that is in itself a huge oversimplification when we look at the work of Elinor Ostrom and all kinds of different bundles of access and no access and so on. This is oversimplification. So we would look at private property, collective property, and common property. So collective property is held by members of a group jointly but divisible. That means that I'm part of that collective, probably maybe a member of a public or private corporation, and I have my shares, and I can take my shares and leave. I can sell it because they are divisible. In common property, and sometimes we confuse common property with collective property, in common property, we have a collection of rights. We are co-owners, co-equal owners. And what is important here is that the rights are not divisible among persons. A member cannot take his share and just sell it. And the membership is defined not only by owning those shares, but it's defined for a series of political, social, cultural considerations. and it's not open access. I know when we are talking about private property or common property, people tend to think about the tragedy of the commons, the famous Harlem common problem. Well, this is not open access. There are rules on who participates and who does. And there are other examples. Community service co-ops in BC, very different than the traditional co-ops. Social initiative co-ops, cooperative social in Uruguay, collective interest co-op society in France, social solidarity co-ops in Portugal, and even the community interest corporations in the UK can be considered CIPSs. Because they are all built in an adoption of common property. They have a very defined characteristic, adoption of common property, indivisible, okay? They have a history. We look at all these different types. They have a history of experimentation. In many of that experimentation, they have used older forms, traditional forms, and moved from there. And they have variations in these organizational structures. They have made different kind of organizational structures. Many received legal recognition in the 90s and early 2000s. Now I know Bernie Sanders has been very popular these days, and Bernie Sanders was one of the congressmen that passed the legislation for community land trusts in the United States in 1992. But having all kind of experimentation, there's no one model, even within the community land trust. So here is a little table. I don't expect that you read every single part. However, we can just look here, the purpose, benefits, the general interest of the community, provide goods and services, okay? Benefits for community. And we can look at property rights. They are all based on property rights here. And we can look what happened after the assets go in liquidation. No divisible, they pass to a similar organization. They are all not divisible. In the case of community interest corporation, there is asset law. Distribution of surplus is limited. Sometimes there doesn't exist, or sometimes it exists, or sometimes it's limited. Now, these days we are talking a lot, especially in North America, about different types of legislations and different types of social enterprises. So we are talking about the core Bs and the LC3s, the hybrid kind of social enterprises. So here, let's look at how they compare. So we have here the CIPSs. Of course, again, I don't expect that you read all that, but look at the purpose, the property regime, and the assets on liquidation. So here, property rights is common property in the case of CIPSs, private in publicly traded companies. In traditional co-ops, always co-ops are kind of in the gray zone. In some cases it's divisible, in something not divisible, owned in common. And then the hybrid that is treated as a for public trade company. What happened with the assets? Not divisible in the case of CIPSs, distribute to bondholders after, of course, all the expenses, all the credit, all have been paid. Traditional co-ops depends. In some places, some legislation allows them to demutualize. In other cases, doesn't allow to demutualize. And hybrid is for publicly traded company. So there is again, if we look at how CIPSs are located, we see some very, very common characteristics here. Now, CIPSs are new organizational forms because they have these very central features. Common property at the center, right? At the center and for benefit to the society, not only the members, but benefit to the society, to the community, a broader community, right? And they are part of a political project. We follow RAL work on social movements. They are part of a political project. It's a political project that goes there. And many, after so much mobilization and experimentations, they are recognized in legislation after a period of experimental innovation in all their forms. Right? The CLT has been going all different forms until 1992. They have some kind of legislation behind them. And so they are, if we follow Rao again, they are the outcome of social movements, having organization, having experimentation, having collective action. So they are, in a way, a social movement. So far, we have proposed that sepsis can be seen as a class of new organizational form, as emerging in a social political environment dominated by neoliberal assumptions and policies, use of common property, which is a mechanism at odds with presumption of foundations of market capitalism, on how development should take place or takes place, and the outcome of collective activity amounting to social movements. Now, let's look at Karl Polanyi, the great economic historian. He reminds us the markets having always been with us, but not a market system. And what it means is that market consideration, economic consideration, have been embedded in social, political, and cultural considerations. But now what we have is the reverse. Markets dominate our society, the markets decide everything, and we know, many of us that are in universities, we know how is that working. A market system also requires the creation of fictitious commodities. That's the famous word that Paul Polanyi uses, fictitious commodities. What are those fictitious commodities? Labor, land, and money. Because those were created, they weren't created to be sold and bought, okay? And there is where the commodification takes place. So parcels of land or nature have been taken out, and now we have land. Parcels of human life have been taken out and now become workforce, labor. And money that has been something that we created, was created as a means of exchange, now become a capital. And of course, we all have seen, how far this has gone in society with the crisis of the 2008. But one process that happens here, commodification distorts things. So things that were value, intrinsic value, use value, become for exchange value. That means, in the case of the housing, for example, that housing is a place where we, is something that protects us, we live on, but now become a commodity, an exchange commodity. And so that explains why those houses are empty, the condominiums are empty, where people are in the street without homes. Because become part of this exchange value. It's just another commodity that circulates. Now, Polanyi makes us aware and warn us that a society that becomes so market, right? Even organs, even many things that should not be commodified is commodified. So when a society becomes that everything has a price, so much commodification is going on, that will destroy society. And if not controlled. So there are forces. There are forces that goes toward marketizations, and there are forces to resist that marketization. And that's what he calls the double movement. Now, how does this say about the place of sepsis in our economic climate? What is the place? Our argument is that the institution of common property at the heart of sepsis identifies them as a part of a counter movement to which neoliberalism is committed. Because neoliberalism is an amplified movement toward complete marketization. The fundamental assumption of the neoliberal project is that the private profit incentive operating in self-regulating market is the optimal means to produce and distribute social goods. Now, SIPSIS counter this in two different ways. The basis in common property take away the individual profit out of the question because it's individual profit. Secondly, reduce dependence on market exchange by process of demedification. Again, once something is taken out, like the land, in the case of the video, there is a process of the commodification. So it's a force reducing this marketization. So what is the impact of this counter movement? The effect of SIPSIS in broadening resistance to neoliberal marketization remains to be seen. We don't know. In fact, when we think about this continuum, it's possible that some SIPSIS can move toward neoliberalism. We know that neoliberals have this ability to domesticate forces, to have this ability to co-opt. And we have seen it. Many of us working in the sector have seen organizations going in that direction and the tensions that are being created in that space. However, the counter forces are there. The seeds are there. So SIPSIS have possibilities for further innovation. Already have a very important innovation with the common property. But there are big possibilities for others, and we are just scratching the surface here. In many places, when we talk about innovation, there is a tool. Governments, universities use as a tool for economic growth and competitiveness. However, SIPSIS have a different foundation of what is called innovation. The foundation is in reciprocity, in solidarity, and their own practices of the commodifications opens a different way to considering what human flourishing is about. These days, many scholars have called attention, including Tim Jackson, that we need to find another ways that of this marketization, another ways of don't keep using natural resources, especially with climate change, that we need to find other ways to define what is success, what is prosperity. And I believe, and my colleagues believe, that SIPSIS could be a way to reconsider what human flourishing is about. There are many other questions about SIPSIS. Are there other social enterprises? We are just looking at some, but there are other social enterprises that are using common property. Where are they and how they interact with local cultures? One of my studies is, and I was hoping to finish to present it here, was with First Nations people in Canada. How does SIPSIS interact with local culture? What is the role there? Are they spreading and diffusing? How effective are these kind of social enterprises in achieving social goals? How do they resist the pressures to conform to neoliberal expectations and measures? Because they are all live someplace and they have to do different things. How they are resisting? How they are conforming and living in that kind of environment? Are there other kinds, and this is what I invite you to discuss, are there other kind of fictitious commodification that have been challenged by forms of social enterprises? For example, education. Thank you. Gracias.